From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus.
Welcome to Middle East Focus. I'm Mike Sexton, Director of MEI Cyber Program, sitting in this week for Alistair Taylor. Today we're going to talk about cryptocurrencies in the Middle East. Cryptocurrencies are a new, critical, and incredibly complicated subject, and nowhere is this more apparent than in the Middle East. Today we're going to run a three-way roundtable to address the regional, legal, and technical angles of this multifaceted subject. Joining me are Sarah Johansson and Mohammed Soliman. Sarah is a graduate scholar with the cyber program at MEI. Her previous work has considered the international legal remits of state-perpetrated and sponsored cyber attacks. She received her LLB in law with a public international law focus from Queen Mary University of London. Mohammed is a non-resident scholar at the Middle East Institute Cyber Program and a senior associate at McClarty Associates Middle East and North Africa practice. His work focuses on the intersection of technology, geopolitics, and business in the Middle East and North Africa. Mohammed, we hear about cryptocurrencies around the world as a trend, and it's difficult to kind of separate the hype from the reality. How common is the trade and the mining of cryptocurrencies in the Middle East?
So when it comes to mining of cryptocurrencies in the Middle East, we can divide the region into three groups. First one is crypto backing Gulf states. Second one is crypto skeptics nations in North Africa. And the third and final bucket is war-torn nations, usually in Levant, Yemen, and Iraq. Let me dive into the crypto backing Gulf states. So major economies like Saudi Arabia, UAE, Bahrain, Qatar, they're investing heavily in diversifying their economy away from oil into tech-empowered economy. So they're looking into cryptocurrency as an opportunity, as something worth investing in. So we're seeing a lot of central banks, especially in Bahrain and UAE and Saudi Arabia, trying to build regulations around cryptocurrencies. In the other bucket, and these are the cryptocurrencies, skeptic nations like Egypt, Morocco, Algeria, for instance, they ban cryptocurrencies because what they believe as a gateway for illicit financing for criminal and terrorist groups. And also they are skeptical of the cryptocurrency as a model that's highly volatile and highly high risk. The third bucket, which is the war-torn nations, this is Syria, Iraq, Yemen. In these nations, there are no central governments that are taking the baton to manage the cryptocurrency environment. However, people and non-state actors are doing mining in their own without really the consent from government or anyone, actually. So for you, Mike, what makes Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies distinct from other digital currencies? What's a blockchain?
So it's sometimes a difficult thing to sort of parse because in news reporting, digital currencies and cryptocurrencies are often kind of conflated. So all cryptocurrencies are digital currencies, but not all digital currencies are necessarily cryptocurrencies. Cryptocurrencies specifically are built around this technology called the blockchain. Now, the blockchain is a unique and very creative cryptographic technology that it takes some of the typical mechanisms that are used in regular things like encryption and instead kind of turns it on its head. So that way it is, instead of hiding information, it is verifying the legitimacy of data, the integrity of that data. So the best way that I can kind of explain the way that blockchain technology works is you imagine for a regular bank, let's say you bank with Chase Bank. When you do transactions, those transactions are sent to a server at Chase Bank, and they'll have backup servers and backup servers and backup servers in different locations with different network configurations to protect that. And that can achieve very, very good security. The way that cryptocurrencies achieve security is rather than having just a kind of, a limited number of servers under supervision that are managing those transactions, is in cryptocurrencies, all transactions all the time are being watched and certified by millions of servers around the world, which makes it virtually impossible to actually forge the integrity of a transaction. So the thing that makes this positive is that, if I make a transaction on the blockchain, let's say I'm buying drugs or something illegal, it's virtually impossible for me to actually deny that I did that, because that is essentially public information if that's attributed to me. The downside of that is that when you've got your centralized servers within Chase Bank, if someone forges your credit card and goes and makes a transaction at Target for $1,000, they can refund you. They can say, this was a fraudulent transaction. They give you back the money, even though those $1,000 are effectively out the door. If someone steals your Bitcoin wallet and then does a transaction with your Bitcoin wallet, you actually don't have any central authority, because that was essentially just done and broadcast to everyone. You don't have any 911 to really call in that case. Now, Sarah, I found when it comes to cryptocurrencies, to me, I almost take like a libertarian kind of mindset to it, that I'm like, people should be able to, if I want to buy something with cryptocurrencies or Bitcoin, like dollars or Pokemon cards, like why is that the government's business? So can you sort of explain to me how it is that governments kind of justify and establish legal frameworks around these currencies, traditional and cryptocurrencies, around these transactions?
Yeah, absolutely, Mike. I mean, it's a really good question, but I think both you and Mohammed have suggested some of the reasons why, both technologically and sort of in terms of mindset. But the libertarian point you make, it's not an unfamiliar point, and particularly the UK, US, and Israel sort of take this stance of whether you own cryptocurrency or something else, it's property. So you do what you want and we'll tax you for it. In a lot of countries in the Middle East, however, even the crypto backing Gulf states that Mohammed mentions, there's an underlying principle of sort of fear of the volatility and the hints to illicit finance and things like that Mohammed mentioned as well. And this particularly stems from a sort of fundamental piece of Islamic finance law, as I understand it, where when we trade in legal tender. And that definition, as opposed to something like simply property, suggests a sort of controlled, stable currency and something that's easy to trade with. When you mention Pokemon cards, they have some value, physically, but it's nothing compared to the value that we perceive in them. And I think there's a similar concern in the Middle East around sort of this idealized value. So particularly this idea of volatility, and I think there's a bad reputation, maybe from libertarians like yourself who built it, but this idea that you can use Bitcoin or other cryptocurrencies for essentially whatever you want. It's secure and all of these things, but for some time, it was really favored as a currency because of the ability to carry out transactions rather anonymously, because in the example of Chase Bank, you have this centralized sort of government above you that can tell you whether you're making a good purchase or not. And this doesn't exist necessarily yet for cryptocurrencies, which is both a benefit and a negative for sure. But part of the complexity as to why law is sort of slow around these areas, I think a lot of countries are keen to regulate, but haven't really gotten there yet. And so key to this is complexity around anonymity, as I've mentioned, and anonymity and the use of VPNs, which are virtual private networks, both make this idea of jurisdiction and who actually made the transaction a bit complex. But I think key here is volatility. And Mohammed, as you mentioned, know that cryptos are really volatile. But we also hear about a lot of volatility and instability of regional currencies. So what is truly the difference, and why is a cryptocurrency, which is incredibly volatile, still so attractive? What you'd think is attractive in countries where there's a typically volatile currency is a stable one and a stable store of value.
Like you mentioned, Sarah, Bitcoin is very volatile in terms of value, historically at least. However, in times of political and economic crisis, cryptocurrencies in general, and especially Bitcoins, emerge as a stable store of value. And we have seen this in Lebanon and Venezuela. Let's speak more about Lebanon because this is our case. This is the Middle East. We speak about a country that's going through political and economic crisis. The currency, lira, lost around 90% of its own value. There is no government. Inflation rates hit around 150%. So there are a lot of legitimate fears that the government may default and people cannot really access their finances. As a result, a lot of people, many people, are moving into cryptocurrencies as a safer way to trade currencies, as well as storing their own value or their own wealth in Lebanon. Also, remittances right now. There's a new emerging trend that Lebanese diaspora is sending remittances to Lebanon via cryptocurrencies. We don't really have a specific number about the level or the amount of cryptocurrencies traded in Lebanon, but some experts say that it's around millions of dollars in Lebanon. So that's a very interesting trend. And it's not only Lebanon, it's Syria, it's Libya. A lot of these nations don't really have central governments in place. So this is the way forward. It's either evading sanctions like Syria or just to give aid or send remittances like Libya and Lebanon. My question for you back, Sarah, is a few governments in the Middle East ban cryptocurrencies, like we mentioned. How exactly that's supposed to work? Like, who does this apply to? How this can be enforced, either with VPNs or anonymous browsers like Tor? Like, tell us more about that.
Absolutely. So I think this is a two-part question in a way. Firstly, around what is the law and sort of the bans around cryptocurrencies, and then what is the impact of the technology. So I'll start from the legal aspect. As I mentioned, some countries like Israel essentially accept crypto. They're not really in favor of it, but they'd prefer to outwardly say, it's okay, we'll just tax you as property. So they tax cryptocurrency as capital gains. And then, as you mentioned, sort of the Gulf states have a little bit more of a partial ban approach. So they block companies who haven't basically been given acceptance from the government to trade in cryptocurrencies from facilitating any of these types of transactions. And this is, I guess, a way to stagnate some of the trade, or at least try to not be in approval of it, but not necessarily hindering it actively either. The full bans are seen in countries like Egypt. And again, a lot of these principles are basically statements by the government to say that they're not in favor of it, that it's harmful, particularly under, Islamic legal principles, and saying that it is banned or that people cannot trade in crypto. To be quite honest, I haven't really seen how this is enforced in practice, and I think it varies a lot from government to government. But I think it's more about the government almost expressing a view against this, the dangers of it, and almost the autonomy that you mentioned in Lebanon. I think even though the currency is so volatile, what we see in Lebanon, as you declared, was, people are looking for a way. Maybe it's not the most stable or safe way, but it's a way to have autonomy over your finances. You're not tied to a political system that is also volatile, and sort of separating away from a market that is dangerous to people's personal finances, or having access to their personal finances in a way. But as you mentioned, governments like Lebanon and Egypt aren't really in favor of this. And I think coming from that end, part of why the bans aren't so successful, or why they're not really carried out appropriately, let's say, is because of what I mentioned, the virtual private networks and anonymity. And so why I mentioned jurisdiction and VPNs is because, particularly in a currency or a transactional system that's meant to be global and sort of taking you away from, or allowing you to make transactions outside of your nation or your, within your local bank, it also raises questions about where that money is going, if that's the issue, or where that money is coming from. And on the Bitcoin or other sort of blockchain currencies, the value transcends through several transactions. And so this creates complexity around these jurisdictional questions, and then not knowing exactly who owns it, because there's no central point to pinpoint a person's identity and link it to their transactions unless it's carried out through sort of a legitimized company. Also creates issues around, so if, let's say, Egypt wanted to crack down harshly on people who are trading in cryptocurrencies, where would they start? Who would they start to penalize, and with what force? It's sort of a system that I think a lot of countries are grappling with and starting to discuss to try and determine. But then, leading on from these anonymity and jurisdictional issues that I think we perceive a lot, I'm not sure how true they are. And Mike, would you like to speak a little bit more to this idea of how truly anonymous cryptocurrencies are, and what real risk do they pose to sort of this idea of illicit financing and money laundering? And are they really such a risk?
I love this question so much because it is something where I think there is an incredible amount of misunderstanding with respect to, a lot of people believe that Bitcoins are anonymous, and it is actually very much not the case. It is not exactly not true, but it is much more complicated than that. So let's say I go to Coinbase, which just went public the other day, and I decide I go to open a Bitcoin wallet. I'm going to go and buy $100 in Bitcoin. Coinbase, depending on its jurisdiction, is going to have what is known within like the Department of Treasury and anti-money laundering, counter illicit finance as KYC, or know your customer laws. So like any banks, the actual coin exchange services where you can take your real world money and exchange it for cryptocurrency, they are largely regulated. So that way you need to actually know who is purchasing this cryptocurrency and how much. And so that is where the anonymity is sort of lost. Once that goes into the the blockchain, it is not exactly anonymous. What is created is I will have a number that is associated, randomly generated, and associated with my account, and is specifically associated with my Bitcoin wallet. And any transactions that I make from there, suppose I want to purchase a Yu-Gi-Oh card from Mohammed in cryptocurrencies, that transaction will be public on the blockchain for everyone to see. And supposing someone knows that the end user is Mohammed, they will know that I made that transaction to Mohammed. If they don't know who that specific address is assigned to, law enforcement, if they suspect that it wasn't a Yu-Gi-Oh card, that it was drugs or an illegal weapon, they would be able to subpoena different coin exchanges to be able to say, are you associated with this address? Are you associated with this address? And that is how they would be able to uncover this. Now, there are some ways that you can kind of push the limits of this. There are actual Bitcoin laundering operations that essentially what will be created is there will be like a casino where people will go and they will gamble in cryptocurrencies, and people will give their money to the casino, not to gamble, but so that way the transactions get directed all over the place. And it then becomes much more difficult if they want to take that transaction and move it somewhere else without people seeing. It will be very, very difficult to trace that transaction. So there are those sorts of operations and stuff on the dark web. But it's important, I think, to consider when we are talking about these challenges to de-anonymizing the blockchain, which is very much, in most cases, very possible, that we are talking about. We are taking this mindset from imagining transactions over like Venmo and like direct bank-to-bank transfers, where these things are centrally stored and very easy to trace. But cryptocurrencies in many ways are actually very preferable to just hard cash when it comes to being able to track that movement. If I want to buy a Yu-Gi-Oh card from Mohammed for $5, how on earth is the government supposed to figure that out? There's no way. So in many ways, the sort of notion that this is like an apocalyptic new technology that is going to just become a massive boon for terrorism and organized crime is much more complicated than that. In many ways, if you truly believed in all of the arguments against cryptocurrencies, you could make those exact same arguments to say that we should no longer have paper cash. So Mohammed, given this sort of like kind of more complicated nature as far as the dangers of cryptocurrencies, as far as society, interpersonal relations, and crime, terrorism, where do you think are some places that it might make sense to employ it? Different organizations or industries in the Middle East, whether in the private sector, healthcare, or government?
Excellent question, Mike. It's indeed an emerging trend that countries, especially in the Gulf states, want to adopt advanced technology to enhance their own capabilities and also keep pace with global trends. There are two industries where I see a blockchain being implemented, and they're already being implemented in the Gulf. So we have the healthcare sector and you have the finance. On the healthcare sector, the UAE is pioneering this. They started a blockchain-based system, basically to share assessment information of health professionals, keep the records, and keeping the records of patients and their medication is a priority. And blockchain is helping with this. The second one is the finance sector. So you have, for example, the UAE and Saudi Arabia exchanged digital currencies via blockchain. You have the Saudi Central Bank using blockchain to deploy finances and bonds into local banks. Same thing in Bahrain, where they released some sort of standards. It's called crypto asset module for crypto firms that want to work in the market. So there's a lot of implementations here. It's still new. It's not the peak. It's still the countries are struggling. As you mentioned before, it's a very complex situation, but there is appetite for deploying the blockchain technology in finance and healthcare through government and private sector, especially in the Gulf. In North Africa, not really, not yet. The legal environment and the political will is not really there to deploy that kind of technology right now. That takes me to my final question for Sarah. Considering this wide usage, what are some of the future benefits and challenges in legalizing and using cryptocurrencies from a legal standpoint?
I really like that question because, as we've seen throughout, there is certainly two sides to this coin, even if it is digital. And on the benefits side, like we've seen with Israel, taxation, of course, it's a tool for particularly governments in the Gulf who are wanting to digitalize and grow a digital sort of based economy entirely to start making money off of these digital transactions. And I think it's also an opportunity to get closer to the non-Middle Eastern world and sort of facilitating international trade and growing closer to international partners, certainly, particularly because of this even if it's a volatile value, it's a global value to a cryptocurrency. And so everyone's sort of trading on a similar basis in a way, as opposed to having, different currencies that are being transferred through a foreign exchange and things like that before a deal is made. And certainly another benefit would be what I mentioned or sort of hinted at earlier, but I think it's a step towards future-proofing Middle Eastern economies and certainly any economy around the world, but particularly for Gulf states, this is a step in the right direction. And I think even states who aren't necessarily making headway, I certainly think that people are. People are trying to future-proof themselves and future-proofing their personal economies, and that's where cryptocurrency is playing a huge role, particularly this decentralized idea. And then I think cryptocurrency is going to be seen and defined quite differently in the next 10, 20 years. But from where we are at now, even if it's not just governments future-proofing their economies, I think people are using the cryptocurrencies to do so as well. But then there's also, of course, some concerns. So litigation and sort of holding people accountable was one that I mentioned earlier, particularly on the anonymity and jurisdiction side. And I think this also comes from what Mike said of often the people who are using these currencies for illegitimate purposes are doing so in a very good way and or not necessarily good, depends who you ask, of course, but in a very technologically efficient way, and protecting themselves. So that adds to that complexity. As the criminals get better, so will law enforcement have to become even more technologically apt. But another concern would be around privacy. So as you hinted at, Mike, or as you said, spelled out, because it's not as anonymous as we think, there needs to be, I think, a sort of rules-based system for privacy around the use of blockchain and where these transactions are accessible from, where this data is stored, even if it's a randomized chain of sort of digital signatures that don't mean much. As our technology and sort of fundamental understanding of the blockchain develops as a society, I think there will be growing privacy concerns as well. I don't think that's necessarily the biggest issue at the moment, but it certainly will be as government's capability within this field grows. And another issue, I don't think we've spoken about it a lot, but I think it's worth mentioning, is around centralization. So a lot of the ideas around cryptocurrency, at least at its fundament, was about this idea of decentralization and around the sort of models of regulation or even just rules-based systems for the use of crypto. We have an idea of centralizing where it comes from. Even as you mentioned, Mike, Coinbase, is responsible to someone. They have to have access to certain pieces of data or information and feed that along. And this idea of sort of tying cryptocurrencies closer to a government or closer to a higher body, I guess is a concern to some. I'm not sure how real that threat is at the moment, or whether people want to use it as a normal currency, as you mentioned. I mean, I know Elon is trying to get everyone to buy Teslas with cryptos. So I'm guessing it's, the focus is on making it essentially an accessible normal currency, but it's worth mentioning. But I also think that there's an angle that's quite interesting, and particular to the Middle East, which is around the environmental impact of, for example, crypto mining and sort of the infrastructural impact it has. Because as we've seen, for example, in Iran, it takes a huge toll on sort of the electrical system. But I can't speak much to it, Mike, so I'm going to hand over to you on that one. But if you could tell us a little bit more about, like, what are the impacts on the environment and infrastructure? And I mean, if the Gulf states are trying to become more environmental, is crypto really the right way to go?
Yeah, so this is a really important question. I mentioned earlier how the sort of management of Bitcoin transactions differs from that of just a regular bank. So your bank, as I said, has a sort of limited number of servers, whereas cryptocurrencies have millions of servers all over the world, constantly overseeing these transactions and certifying them. So that actually, in terms of the amount of electricity required for the integrity that is gotten, is staggeringly more than it is for typical currencies or even just other digital currencies. And it's become very salient in Iran because Iran has sort of turned to cryptocurrencies. Initially, they had banned them, but then they sort of warmed to them as a way to kind of evade sanctions. Because if you mine Bitcoins, the blockchain doesn't abide by sanctions. If you're mining Bitcoins, those Bitcoins come to you. And so a lot of Iran had sort of allowed Bitcoin miners to operate within their country, where it is actually pretty profitable to mine Bitcoins, because in Iran, civilian energy usage is subsidized. So the problem that they had was that they had so many people mining Bitcoins that it became a strain on the electric grid, and they began having rolling blackouts and eventually needed to sort of tweak their energy subsidization program. So that way, Bitcoin miners, I do not know right now if they necessarily still have only partially or in some ways subsidized. They're still permitted, but they've tried to curtail it a bit because they've realized that it was putting too much stress on their electric grid. Now, this is taking like a really significant So when we think about things that are in public front of mind right now, cryptocurrencies, climate change are two very big things. This is the kind of irony about Elon Musk tweeting that he wants people to buy Teslas with Bitcoins because he wants you to buy an energy-friendly electric car with an actually very energy unfriendly currency. So the University of Cambridge has a tool called the Cambridge Bitcoin Electricity Consumption Index, or CBECI. The results of this change every day as countries' energy usage change and the number of Bitcoin mining servers change. But right now I'm looking at it. Currently, the total energy usage of Bitcoin is about 139 terawatt hours per year. That probably doesn't mean much to you, but it will actually rank this in terms of countries. And ironically enough, it is sandwiched right between the two countries you guys are from. It is slightly more than the energy consumption of Sweden, which is 132 terawatt hours per year, and slightly less than Egypt, which is 151 terawatt hours per year. So when you're thinking about this on the global scale, as far as like a trend that a lot of people are sort of saying, maybe we should be investing in Bitcoins, maybe this is a futuristic and helpful technology. In many ways, this runs very much counter to the climate accords, because your Bitcoin mining is like an entire another country that needs to be a signatory, right? So it's going to be a really difficult question, I think, in the future. It's not something that I think responsibly around the world we should look to as an economic resource from an environmental perspective, unless it is coming in tandem with an extreme and very rapid move towards renewable energy to be able to sustain that.
I think it's really interesting that you have that data in front of you, because even though I knew it was certainly a drain on sort of electrical systems, I did not know that it was to that scale. So that's actually crazy. Yeah, well, to add to the regulation that's going to be necessary and sort of where we're looking for the future, then, yeah, we're going to have to find some sort of regulatory limits on how much this can drain our both energy resources and sort of our carbon emission levels, because that's a huge amount.
We'll have to leave things there for today. Thank you, Sarah and Mohammed, for joining us, and to our production team for their work on today's program. And thank you to our audience. We hope you have enjoyed this special episode of Middle East Focus. We will see all of you next week.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.